Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, everybody. I hope you're all still awake. I know lunch is coming next, so that's my first slide. I thought you all were going to be eating lunch during my talk, so I wanted to make sure everybody was chewing. But since you're not going to get lunch till after this, I'm going to try to be quick. I think they put me at the end because I'm supposed to, give you a little bit of a pep talk as you go into the roundtable discussions and encourage you to stay for those discussions because all of this feels very overwhelming. We've heard a lot of information this morning, from the Sandy stories that are so devastating to Peter's very poignant and to the point slides about what's coming in our future for our children. But I don't want us to despair, and I don't want us to feel like that's going to freeze us, that we are going to drown in these waters. We need to become climate change survivors, and that's my message to us today, is to think about what we've already done, what we can do, and what lies ahead for us to take on as challenges. All right, so just really briefly, because you heard this morning right from the folks who experienced it, that Sandy, at least for me, brought home and reminded me how truly vulnerable we are. And when I say we, I say our communities. Communities where I grew up in the Ironbound community, communities that we work with all over New Jersey, all over New York, communities that, yes, we have a lot of low-income minority residents. We have a lot of challenges like the industries that surround us, but we also have a lot of vibrancy. We have a lot of cultural and social networks. We have a lot of richness in our communities. And I was just really taken by how truly vulnerable all of that is in a moment, how all of that can get washed away, how fragile our communities are in times of disaster. And so, I wanted to just point out what others have already mentioned and was certainly true in our community was that, we sometimes forget because we are surrounded by these industries in New Jersey. We live side by side with the smokestacks and the highways and the waterways. And many of these things present challenges to us every day, right? Air pollution, water pollution, and we fight those things as EJ advocates to try to improve our neighborhoods. But when disaster comes like flooding or extreme heat, it's just another layer of burden that's already on us every day. So, we're surrounded by industrial waterfronts. We also have aging and failing infrastructure that, a lot of times we don't even see that. It's all the pipes under the ground, the sewer systems. But when Sandy came, it was very obvious because everybody was swimming in it. Everybody saw and smelled the sewage. Millions of gallons of sewage being dumped into the bay, into our communities every day. And it just reminded us that 100-year-old pipes cannot withstand what's coming. And we need to start investing in that infrastructure. And our communities have some of the oldest and most aging infrastructure. Limited resources to prepare and recover. We heard from the housing advocates, and we're reminded that, while it's difficult for everyone to recover, we saw the devastation on the shore. We didn't hear a lot in the media about our communities, about how difficult it is every day to struggle to keep your family going, to survive, to pay the rent, and then all of a sudden something happens like this disaster, and you were already living sort of on the margin, and it can be devastating not just for you and your family, but for generations. You could get displaced from your community could disappear. And so for us, these risks and these limited resources put us in even greater harm's way and has a more long-lasting effect. We heard from Mary and from Anna this morning the communications breakdown, the absolute and utter lack of communication, especially with our communities. We had people in public housing stuck on top floors for weeks, no heat, no hot water. We had families that were undocumented that were afraid to speak to anyone, that basically just disappeared, some of them almost homeless. And, we had disaster recovery people coming in from all over the country, very well-intentioned people, some of them, who had no idea where this community was, how to talk to them. Some of them didn't speak the language. They didn't want to get out of their cars. It was very obvious that we had a breakdown. In the city of Newark, we didn't even have evacuation orders. We had neighbors helping neighbors. And that comes to my last point, that despite all these challenges, what Sandy reminded us is that we will help each other in times of need. neighbors, family, community-based organizations, churches. The people who have always been there making our community strong are the people and the places that are going to continue to help make us strong. So the importance of those social networks and investing in those networks, because we do have resources in our communities. And this is just a snapshot. Peter spoke to the long-term vulnerability that we have. We have a lot of vulnerabilities in our communities. Lack of access to health care, the potential for displacement in housing. We have storm surges that are going to continue to bring flooding and increased flooding to our communities, and heat. A lot of us are focused on Sandy and on water. But every summer, we have tremendous heat waves. And every year, I hear the increased numbers of days above 90 degrees, above 100 degrees. And the folks that die from that heat, those extreme heat days, continues to increase. There are figures that deaths from heat-related illness in Newark and Camden will increase five-fold by the year 2050. Five-fold. So we need to start paying attention to these vulnerabilities in our communities, because people will die from these types of vulnerabilities. Okay, so we know we have some challenges, but the point of today is really to talk about resiliency and adaptation. How are we going to survive these changes? How are we going to thrive among these changes? How will we adapt? And hopefully, how will we help to mitigate and stop the climate changes that are happening? So resiliency is something that I think is innate in our communities. Poor, low-income, minority communities have, by their very nature, had to be resilient to survive. We are very resilient groups of people, so, resourceful. But in the terms of climate change, I think we have to start thinking about different frameworks of resiliency. Not just at the individual or family level, at the community level, at the regional level. How do we begin to anticipate the kinds of changes that are coming? And how do we start to prepare for those changes? And of course, adaptation looks at how the entire community and ecosystem can anticipate some of those climate change conditions. The increased heat, the increased flooding. Some of the examples of resiliency, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about exactly, these are the 5 things you should do to become more resilient. There are a lot of really good examples of how we can become more resilient, and a lot of those things we're already doing in our communities. Urban agriculture, farming, things like planting more trees and planting more green space to buffer against storms. Cooling centers and making cooling centers available, and energy, retrofitting our homes, having local food sources. These are a lot of these things many of our communities are working on already. We're just not thinking of it in the climate change framework, but it is part of becoming more resilient. And so maybe what we need to do today is talk about what are all those things that we're already doing and investing in our communities that make us more resilient, and what other ideas are out there that we can partner on and work on to bring into our communities, like this micro grid that Juan Camilo mentioned. How do we get our own local sources of power? I mean, how many of you had no power after Sandy? No heat, no hot water. Some of us no phones, no way to even communicate. So, that in that moment you start to think, how can I get myself some energy? Where can I go plug in? How can I, how can I get off this grid? And so those are some of the innovative ideas that maybe we can try to talk about in our small groups. But the one thing I want to emphasize here is that there's a lot of people having conferences and meetings and summits in Trenton and all over the state, all over the region about how to become more resilient, how do we invest in our infrastructure, make green infrastructure. Very few of those discussions are happening with the people that are on the ground that are directly impacted. Very few of those discussions. And this is why this gathering is so unique, because we want to begin that discussion from the folks that are experiencing it or working with people who are experiencing it on the ground, who are most vulnerable, and including that input into the discussion. Part of the problem is we have emergency management plans. I guarantee you almost every single town here has an emergency management plan, but almost no one knows what it looks like or what it says. because it was created by some county administration that never, 600-page emergency management plan that no one will ever look at. And so that's part of the problem. We have to make those things a reality in our communities, and that's not going to come from the top down. That has to come from us. We need to bring those ideas up and start planning for ourselves and making those mitigations come from our communities. So the direct involvement and inclusion of our communities in those measures, in those planning, in the communication strategies. If we don't see our communities represented there, we need to insert ourselves there, and we need to bring those solutions there. And these are just some pictures of what resiliency looks like, taken from all over this is actually all pictures from New Jersey and New York, of what resiliency looks like. It looks very green, it looks very solar, it looks like people doing it for themselves. I also want to mention just a report that is online called The Climate Gap that was done out in California. And as a reminder to say that there's a lot of things we can do on the ground in our communities, but there's also a lot of organizing and advocacy that we also have to do. That we have to be part of the discussion that's happening in this national and regional context around climate change, because if we are not in that conversation, our communities get left behind. And one of the things that gets talked about a lot is how to reduce carbon, how to reduce emissions from CO2. But for EJ communities, Nikki mentioned that in our communities, there's a direct correlation with air pollution, hazardous environmental conditions, and income and race. And unless we address that status quo condition, our communities will always be more vulnerable. So some of the policies that we need to work on and advocate for in the state of New Jersey and at the federal level is making investments in our communities, reducing dirty air in our communities, the pollution in our communities, addressing the health impact gap, right? Health insurance, health care coverage for all of us so that when the disaster comes, we can be prepared and more resilient. Planning and intervention and mapping of our communities. There's a lot of attention about the shore, how the shore was hit. That's very important, how the shore was hit. But I think we need to see more of our communities reflected in those intervention and those planning documents and those policy statements. We need to map our own communities. Juan Camilo showed some amazing maps. We need those maps here in New Jersey. We need to share those maps with our neighbors and with our friends in our churches. So those are some of the policy and advocacy things that I think we also need to think about. There's things we could do on the ground today in our communities, and then there's things that we need to organize with our neighbors and with our communities to influence policy at the state and federal level. And Juan Camilo mentioned the Sandy regional plan. There were some really good ideas that came out of that, and I think we will also create and generate some of those ideas about having local folks be certified trainers to help their neighbors in distress, investing in local food production, local energy production, disaster centers and resiliency centers in our neighborhoods, doing our own community-based plans. And we see a little picture of all of our, some of you are here today again, that we were, New Jersey was definitely in the house at the New York Sandy planning effort. And I was going to end, I made Molly remove the Destiny's Child, we are survivors, song to pump you all up. But I do want to encourage all of you to think of yourselves as not just as climate change survivors, but climate change thrivers. And we are going to survive, and we are going to get through this, but we have to do it together and with allies. And it starts, we're going to start today, get a little lunch, and we're going to start generating that energy that we need to become climate change survivors. So thank you.